You might agree with me that one of the biggest shames of pirate history is just how poorly documented these scoundrels are. They left behind next to no writings, and most of the information on them was written by biased officials. And since the colonies were poorly documented overall, they didn't have much to say anyway. This leaves pirate history susceptible to legends and romanticism, lies and half-truths to fill in the gaps, to paint the blank canvas in whatever image the artist desires. In no work is this more apparent than Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates. Half a history book, half a work of fiction, the very name of Charles Johnson was a pen name based on a successful playwright, and many of the stories in the book were overly dramatized or flat out invented. There's a strong ideological leaning to the book, seeking to portray the piratical anti-heroes as pseudo-revolutionaries, republicans, and gritty freedom fighters. In a time of extreme censorship, Johnson used pirates as an allegory to critique the justice system, government, and to discuss Enlightenment ideas. Historians have since debated the political ramification of Golden Age pirates, how ideological they were, and what they actually thought. Some view them as proto-revolutionaries, others take the whole thing as a fantasy and pirates to be nothing but cynical drunks, driven by nothing but the spectre of greed. Certainly, the pirates of the early 18th century had political leanings. They often expressed support for the deposed Stuart dynasty, aligning themselves with the Jacobite movement. This ideology is far from the freedom-loving, revolutionary sentiment we might imagine. Johnson wasn't the first to associate pirates with rebellion against society. One of the first major written works on a pirate, The Grand Pirate, describing the life of George Cusack, was in all likelihood a semi-work of fiction, just like Johnson's book, but it differs from Johnson in several crucial aspects. Most importantly, the 1674 The Grand Pirate aligns itself with monarchy and the state. Cusack is portrayed as a rebel that defies both God and government, destroying legal documents, usurping courtly language to assume power, and aligning himself with Satan. The Grand Pirate is, in many ways, much more influential to the history of pirates than Johnson's work. In 1655, England conquered Jamaica, initiating a 15-year period of near-constant Caribbean warfare. The newfound colony had to deploy naval officers and independent mercenaries to undertake piratical forays against the Spanish, and there was no word to describe their activities, nor legal mandate managing their operations. These men fought Spain on their Jamaican and imperial interest, whether England and Spain were actually at war or not. This led to the development of the word privateer, which did not exist before the 1660s. This period was essentially an experimental phase, used to iron out what was acceptable for a privateer and what wasn't. It was alright to attack the enemy in times of war, but if you did it in peace, you were a pirate. It would take until the early 18th century for the line between pirate and privateer to be firmly established. The Grand Pirate was published just 4 years after the peace treaty with Spain, and it is the first major written work in English to fully condemn piracy. The age of rampant peacetime privateering was supposed to be over, but the book went much further. Cusack, as aforesaid, is portrayed as a rebel against God and monarchy itself, the foundational pillars of popular society. By quashing him, the state reasserts control over its earthly dominion. The story of Cusack becomes an allegory for the supremacy of the government. It was published only 14 years after the monarchy was reinstated. 2 years prior, England had been ruled by a republican dictator, Oliver Cromwell, who had executed the previous king in a violent revolution. The Grand Pirate can be read as an allegory for the monarchy cementing itself over these upstart republican remnants. in the satanic speeches of Captain Cusack, one can find parallels to two literary figures, Dr. Faustus and Milton's Satan. Dr. Faustus, protagonist of the namesake play written by Christopher Marlowe in the 1580s, aligned himself with Satan in a narcissistic quest for power. Marlowe and the play both are fascinating, reflecting ideas of atheism and even Gnosticism, an ancient sect that would be influential in medieval heresies and Renaissance thought. Milton's Satan, the anti-hero of Paradise Lost, is a tragic rebel against God and the heavenly order. Milton himself was a personal advisor to Oliver Cromwell, probably supported the king's execution, but seems to have lamented the failure of the Republican experiment. Both Marlowe and Milton, and their characters, seems to have been reflective of radical political ideas. Ideas that were superimposed on George Cusack, the pirate. To be a pirate was to oppose God, the monarchy, the very fabric of society. It was no different from the treasonous Republicans that decapitated Charles I. The Grand Pirate was allegorical, but was there a grain of truth to it? Were there radical elements among the 17th century pirates? The colonies and pirates both were poorly documented, and it is difficult to discern what these people really thought. However, by digging through the available material, placing it in a wider context and reading between the lines, a spark of potential can be seen. There is evidence indeed of radical sentiment among the Buccaneers. This evidence points to them being superstitious believers in magic, and followers of ideas that, to us, seem weirdly modern or completely bewildering. Collective ownership intermingled with accelerationism. The end of the world is nigh, and it is a good thing. In this video, we shall dive into the tenets of these insane ideologies, and look for evidence of their presence among the Buccaneers. First of all, we need a bit of context. Where did these ideas come from?
Let's be content in the times lament. You see the world turned upside down.
The 17th century is one of those periods that are often overlooked and seen as a kind of dull interlude between the more exciting Middle Ages and the Industrial Revolution. Speaking of revolutions, the English Civil War is often overshadowed by later conflicts like the American Civil War or the French Revolution. The English Civil War often seems to take on a very basic character. Some guys in hats fought, other guys in helmets. The king was decapitated. Here are some colorful paintings of it. The scarce popular interest there is in this conflict tends to focus on the battles and tactics, not the bewildering ideological backgrounds and developments of the conflict, or the horrifying cost in life. Approximately 4% of the English population perished during the wars, 6 in Scotland, succeeding the American Civil War casualties of 3% of the total population. These numbers are absolutely horrific, but they pale in comparison to the Irish casualties of 41%. To put it in context, the much more well-known potato famine killed 16% of the Irish population, which Ireland has yet to recover from. These bloody episodes do rarely if ever come from nowhere, and the conflict known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms were provoked by strong convictions, philosophical developments, and decades of pent-up frustration. It was in this fiery crucible that the insane ideologies of piracy and colonial policy were forged. But it did not come from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades, centuries, with the possibility of some having predicted this violent outcome. Even that fateful shortening of the king in 1649. Looking back to the centuries before, it is somewhat difficult to decipher the thoughts and minds of the common people. It was easier to regulate information and control popular thought when a vast majority of news and knowledge was passed on by word of mouth. Most of theology and philosophy was kept and created by the clergy, the only caste with complete literacy, and who primarily kept it in foreign, arcane languages, Latin. Apart from the occasional heresy, pretty much always made by rogue clergymen, medieval ideology was uniform. All of this changed with the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century. Literature of all kinds could now be produced at an unprecedented rate. A monk might need weeks or months to copy a manuscript. A press could do it in days, even hours. Books aside, you got ballads, broadsides, newsletters, much of it generously supplied with cartoonish images, roughly comparable to modern memes and baby boomer satire. Ideas and information could now be spread to more people at an accelerated pace. This technology straddled hand in hand with the Protestant Reformation. One of its core tenets is that every Christian should be able to read the Bible themselves and form their own interpretation. Bibles were translated from Latin into common languages, and people were promoted to learn to read. Today we often associate Christianity with the suppression of thought and ideas, but here it was absolutely crucial in the development of self-reliance and individualism. As more people learned to read, they simultaneously got easier access to ancient classics, allowing them to learn, recycle, and develop new ideas of thought. This development occurred alongside the evolution of the modern theatre. Its prominence is the most apparent in England, where playwrights did not only have to rely on wealthy patrons, but could also gain payment from the popular audience. The English theatre was accessible to everyone, regardless of class or literacy, and a great medium in which to convey the ideas and atmosphere of the day. Not least because playwrights themselves were well read in the classics, primarily because they sought inspiration from fiction and history, but because this reading, as a consequence, led them to develop complicated trains of thought. Since they often had wealthy patrons, they became embroiled in court politics, and theatre became a way in which to praise their patrons or critique them. It is therefore not surprising that we can discern ideological messages or reflections in the popular plays. One can read anti-monarchist sentiment in Marlowe's Tamburlaine, or even traces of atheism in his controversial Faustus. In this play, the demon Mephistopheles claims that hell is where he is. This idea became popular with later thinkers, some believing Satan to be an allegory, and heaven and hell a state of mind, not a place. The theatre was a place where fiction and reality would intersect, evidenced by Essex Rebellion in 1601. Before the Earl of Essex launched his unsuccessful revolt, several of his co-conspirators paid the Globe Theatre to include their deposition of demands in their performance of Richard II. Richard II contains subtle critique towards the very state of monarchy. Here it is suggested that gardeners are superior rulers. Another period author called Adam a gardener, and some argued that there were no gentlemen in the days of Adam and Eve. People began to question the corruption of the royal court and the effectiveness of monarchy as an institution. Much of it was a consequence of England's position as a country. As an island nation, the country was highly defensible, and with Scotland brought under personal union, there were no risks of foreign invasion. The Spanish Armada had been defeated, France was on friendly terms, and the people and economy prospered. This place of comfort allowed them to ponder on alternate ways of ruling the country, and how to conduct commerce, trade, even warfare. The Netherlands served as a great inspiration. It was a sort of republic, most of whose power rested with influential merchants. Despite its low population, the Netherlands was extremely wealthy and was able to leverage their funds for considerable global efforts. The United Provinces was nothing short of a global superpower. Many Englishmen wanted to emulate it. Not the least because of religion. The Dutch were stalwart Calvinists, a denomination of Protestantism that believed everything was predetermined. Men could find evidence of their divine providence in their material life. If you were well off, you were blessed, my son, and it drove Calvinists to be productive and acquire wealth. Its English equivalent were the Puritans, so called because they wanted to complete the Reformation in England by purifying the national church of its final Catholic remnants. Many of their reforms were focused on taking away the power of the church and moving it to the hands of common believers, thus shortening the common man's distance to God, while democratizing church and society. Since the state church walked hand in hand with the monarchy, these reforms were as political as they were religious, and the Puritans were generally in favor of more democratic systems. However, religious and political developments were held back by censorship, the most effective of which was simply the fact that most people were illiterate. Still, literacy was on the rise, and a literate person could always read aloud to a mass of people. And the monarchy realized early the danger of spreading books with dangerous ideas. Private circulation in the upper class was fine. It was dangerous when these books were mass-produced and became accessible to the common man. Censorship prevented people from engaging with radical new ideas, and from developing their own and discussing them. They had to be filtered using allegory and fiction. In the 1640s, Charles I lost his grip on power. Civil war broke out, censorship collapsed, and church courts ceased to function. Suddenly there was an explosion of newspapers, and foreign books flooded the domestic market, essential for the development of radical new ideas. These heresies and political deviancies might have existed in the underground, or they appeared as a result of the revolution. Either way, the monarchy was on its way out. The king executed in 49, and the victors now had the opportunity to construct a new society from the ground up. A popular ballad captured the atmosphere in its striking title, The World Turned Upside Down. Cromwell's revolution established the rights of property, gave political rights to the propertied, but then re-established dictatorial control, restoring the rule of the gentry and thus allowing for the eventual return of the bishops and king after Cromwell's death. The revolution was a failure and stopped short of anything radical. There were elements in Cromwell's circles that wanted universal suffrage, removal of the state church and Protestant ethic, communal property, and a violent crusade beyond the shores of England. These religio-political sects were the Levelers, Diggers, Ranters, and Millenarians. Echoes of these movements did resurface in England from time to time, but were largely squashed after the restoration of 1660 and return of censorship. Chances are that they did persist in the colonies and among pirates. We will nosedive into the beliefs of these movements, but first we will look for evidence of their presence in the New World. The English Puritans had an old ambition of settling the New World and establishing bases to pirate from the Catholic Spanish. They managed to briefly secure Santa Catalina and Tortuga for these purposes, but no permanence was established until Cromwell's conquest of Jamaica. Of course, Cromwell's Puritanism was state policy, and most of the radical ideologies of this video were too extreme even for him, but they were more or less derived from Puritanism. Indeed, the Americas seemed like a promising refuge for the radicals. In 1649, when the Levelers were finally defeated, John Lilburne offered to lead his followers to the West Indies, but he did not receive financial backing. In the 1680s, a man named Lilburne served as governor of the Bahamas, and he was responsible for commissioning pirates to attack the Spanish. His relation to the leader of the Levelers is uncertain. Prior to or shortly after the Restoration, a large number of radicals emigrated to the Caribbean. In the 1680s, a shoemaker named Joseph Salmon got in trouble for being an Anabaptist. They did not believe in infant baptism and regarded it as a voluntary, adult decision. The movement was therefore a subversion of the state church, heresy. A number of Ranters were also discovered on Barbados. Ranters denied the priesthood and any preacher but God Almighty, which believers had to find for themselves. Other radicals like Quakers, Muggletonians and Familists continued infesting the island. And on Jamaica there was a fifth monarchist, Captain William Wrightson, an amateur lawyer and smuggler. Smuggling was regarded as no different than piracy. The examples go on and on. Radicals were a minority, sure, but were notable enough in the colonies. The colonies also practiced religious and some political tolerance. Since most of the white settlers were indentured servants, often political and religious prisoners, the plantation aristocracy had to secure their loyalty by tolerating their personal beliefs. It wasn't too uncommon for rebel servants to align themselves with black slaves, forming dangerous uprisings. Some colonies, like the Bahamas, even established republican-like governments, not too dissimilar from the ideals of the Levelers and more radical Puritans. To summarize this point, the West Indies were a hotbed of different religious and political ideas. The New World served as a refuge for freethinkers to escape to, a dumping ground of religious and political prisoners, and tolerance was widely practiced by the English colonial governments. Pirates recruited from this pool of different ideas and opinions. Two of the most common sources of Buccaneer recruits were vagabonds and army veterans. Let's start out with the former. England in the early 17th century was rife with vagabonds. People who had no home, no job, and just roamed around the countryside, looking for temporary work, begging, or even robbing and plundering. Vagabonds were looked upon with fear, not least because of outright violent acts, but also since they did not attend church, a direct opposition of the established order. They could and did work as spies and informants for rebel movements, and were susceptible to radical ideas of toppling good society. It was among these ruthless scoundrels that armies found recruits, ship crews hired men, and the government indentured servants. Vagabonds kidnapped and shipped for servitude in the colonies. It's free labor force. They had a piratical mentality at their core, and an undoubtable number of the pirates likely had beginnings in these turbulent ranks. Next we have army veterans, specifically soldiers of the New Model Army. This red-coated force was first established in 1645, and eventually became a political force in and of itself. They primarily consisted of volunteers, men who were dedicated to the parliamentarian anti-monarchy cause. Chaplains were common in their ranks, and soon, many of the rank and file took on preaching roles themselves, many of them radical. Some believed that the army should be used to teach peasants about liberty, and open discussion was encouraged within the ranks. They espoused ideas like republicanism and limits on landed property that anyone could hold, and soon became a threat to Parliament itself. The army was ordered to disband in 1647, but the soldiers refused. Instead, they elected their own representatives from their own ranks, dubbed agitators, so powerful that Cromwell had to share his command of the army with them. They became close allies of the Levelers, a political movement of die-hard Republicans seeking universal suffrage. The Levelers were defeated in 49, but the new model continued, serving as a counterbalance to Cromwell's authoritarianism. Without them, he would likely have crowned himself king. Many of the soldiers were sent to the Caribbean, where they joined forces with buccaneers like Christopher Minks and Henry Morgan. As late as the 1680s, William Dampier mentioned a new model veteran active in his crew. Now very old, he had fought with Cromwell in Ireland. There are some obvious parallels between the government of pirates and the New Model Army. The Buccaneers were much more fond of liberty than later pirates, allowing for political and religious discourse, allowed members to leave whenever they wanted, divided loot at least somewhat equally, managed all major decisions by popular vote, and elected their captain and officers. However, these traditions seem to have predated the new model. It was practiced by the French as much as the English, and seems to have developed independently of radical movements. It was likely done out of practical reasons, meritocracy, besides the fact that pirates considered themselves the nobility of the sea. They were superior to other seamen, and didn't deploy universal suffrage as much as becoming their own aristocratic republic. That is besides them often following under unelected captains, such as commissioned admirals or ship captains, only electing officers if there was no more viable option. So, the systems of the pirates must have developed independently. It isn't proof alone that the average pirate was an educated radical, though he might have been influenced by poverty and frustration with the governing order, like so many commoners were. Either way, the governing systems of the Buccaneers must have been appealing to new model soldiers and radicals of all sorts. In a world where the monarchy had been restored, radicals had to adapt to the world turned upside down, turned right again. To some of them, piracy might have appeared more appealing, not to mention the prominence of hypocrisy across all human society. Someone might personally believe in or espouse certain beliefs in a dreamlike, utopian sense, but ultimately not live up to or practice any of these ideals for a variety of reasons. Think the stereotypical champagne socialist. One piece of very strange evidence to Buccaneer radicalism is their interest in magic. This statement might seem completely fantastic, but in the early modern age, there was no clear separation between religion, political ideology, and magic. The drawing of those lines was one of the great results of the 17th century. One of the big points of Protestantism was the separation of religion from magic. It critiqued Catholic rites of magic, such as the communion literally turning wine and bread to blood and flesh, purgatory and the presence of spirits, the powers of idols, and the ability to buy yourself free from sin. This severance of magic from religion created a vacuum in Protestant societies, where there was no sufficient science to explain all natural phenomena. This spurred a kind of experimentalist attitude, which led to the development of modern science. But in between that endpoint, magic was seen as a form of science. Recognized scientists like Newton, Kepler, and Locke all believed in astrology, that Earth and the planets had living souls, that minerals could regenerate, and that worms and small insects just manifested out of mud and slime. Calvinists actually opposed the revival of magic, but it was received with open arms by religio-political radicals, those with revolutionary politics. Most of the ideologies discussed in this video were proponents of astrology, alchemy, and such forms of magic, and they were closer to the ideas of common people, who still harbored superstitious beliefs, ideas of magic, spirits, and so on. There was a strong link between magic, radicalism, and the lower classes. Pirates were primarily from the lower classes. Superstition and belief in the supernatural was surely rife among them. Pirates are poorly documented, and since both radicalism and magic were looked down upon by the ruling church and state, those who were published naturally had to put padlocks on their pens. We can still find traces of magic beliefs among the Buccaneers. A prisoner of Henry Morgan said that the Admiral had a witch aboard to prophesize and advise him. William Dampier wrote with fascination of how he was cured of a parasite by a witch doctor. His colleague, Lionel Wafer, wrote critically of some superstition, but appears to have been convinced that the shamans of the Kuna tribe could communicate with spirits and use them to tell the future, such as the timely arrival of ships. Finally, Dampier wrote how one of his captains, Swan, had an astrologer aboard. Dampier indicates that the astrologer was correctly able to predict the Spanish use of a fire ship. What is interesting here is that both Dampier and Wafer were natural scientists, progenitors of Darwin, and, much like their contemporaries, magic appears to have been highly fascinating to them, and a reasonable explanation to certain natural phenomena. The sources we have speaking of magical beliefs among pirates are few, but considering how scattered and spread out they are, it seems convenient to assume that it was common enough among them, and that radical political ideas were present as well, since they were sympathetic both to lower classes and to beliefs in magic. Religion, superstition, and magic is something to be tackled in future episodes. It is a massive topic, all on its own. Having now discussed the possible appearance of radicals among the 17th century pirates, we can take a look at some of the radical movements in question. Most Englishmen were either pro-monarchy Anglicans or more democratic Puritans, the latter believing in the aforementioned principle of predestination. A minority of people had been chosen by God before birth to be redeemed, and they could find evidence of their election in their material prosperity on earth. The Puritans strived to make money because riches were evidence of their divine providence. They also believed that these elected people were saints, and that saints should govern society. The problem with this theory was that it was difficult to sell to most people, and Puritan leaders like Cromwell had to convince the masses that any one of them might be elected, even if they didn't know it. A more radical idea began to surface, declaring that Christ had died for all mankind, that all might be saved, and all you needed was the will to be saved. It is reminiscent of the beliefs of Martin Luther. The political implications were that all men were equal, all men were saints. And if saints should govern society, the conclusion was universal suffrage. This philosophy formed the groundwork of the Leveller movement. Though unusual for the 17th century, many of their ideas are nowadays taken for granted. They were a democratic political movement, whose name derived from a rebellious practice of leveling the enclosures of property, fences and such, symbolically making the nobility equal to common men. The Levellers had their origins in the shadows of censorship, and did not appear until the late 1630s when one of their leaders were arrested, having distributed illegal pamphlets. Since the early days of the Revolution, Richard Overton operated a secret press that printed provocative texts. What makes the Levellers stand out from other political groups isn't their political message, as much as their ability to convey it. They were incredibly effective at organizing, discussing popular politics, mobilizing and leveraging media to their advantage. In 1648, they operated their own newspaper, The Moderate, and their symbols included rosemary branches and sea green ribbons, usually worn at demonstrations. They notably allied themselves with the agitators of the New Model Army, forming a possible link to veterans that might later become colonial troops or Buccaneers. Between 1647 and 1649, they, together with the agitators, published the Agreement of the People, trying to establish an English constitution. The agreement was published during a crisis of an undemocratic parliament, when the Cromwellians were considering the return of the king, something which the Levellers opposed entirely. 5 proposals were made: more equal electoral constituencies, the dissolution of the current parliament, annual parliaments, the supremacy of the people, and the sovereignty of the parliament they choose in election. It then added 5 reserved powers, which parliament had no capacity to alter: freedom of religious worship, freedom from military conscription, indemnity for acts carried out in wartime, equality before the law, and that no law should be destructive to the safety and well-being of the people. The final paragraph declared these to be the Englishmen's native rights, going back to their ancestors. Indeed, the Levellers often looked to history, and believed that English freedom had been lost with the Norman conquest. The Levellers were popular with the people of London, with one of their petitions receiving support from 1/3 of all Londoners. However, as the government became more tyrannical, Levellers faced increased opposition. One of their members of parliament was killed during an attempted kidnapping in 48, and soldiers were banned from petitioning. Many of them were cashiered, and several were even court-martialed and executed. One of the executed soldiers, an agitator named Robert Lockyer, had his funeral attended by thousands of mourners, all of them wearing the sea green ribbons and adorning his casket with the rosemary branches. In 49, most of the Leveller leadership was arrested and thrown in the Tower of London. They wrote a list of demands to the current government, which were refused. But many of its proposals have since been accepted, like the right to silence. Cromwell attacked a group of mutinous Levellers shortly afterwards, killing the ringleaders and purging his army of Leveller support. This effectively ended their movement. The writings would more or less survive in England, albeit under heavy censorship. Leveller ideas did resurface on occasion, but never achieved any major significance. In the 1720s, privateer Captain George Shelvocke derisively compared a mutinous group aboard his ship to Levellers, though it seemed more to be an insult than some attempt to actively accuse them of political heresy. The 1640s were all around a bad time. The Civil War was combined with a series of bad harvests, wages lagged behind, taxes were raised, and the cost of living rose significantly. Meanwhile, the traditional relationship between landlord and tenant was breaking down, when land was being sold to those who had money. One of the big issues of the day were gentry claiming large tracts of land and forbidding anyone else from using it. People weren't allowed to settle where they pleased, and this is where the Levellers drew their name from, levelling the fences of enclosures, marking off noble property. The Levellers consisted of many different subgroups, the more moderate concerned with suffrage, the more radical with economics and class conflict. Some of these radicals were not content with the Levellers' solutions, and decided to walk the extra mile. Initially called the True Levellers, they soon took on the mantra of diggers. Their leader was a certain Gerard Winstanley, a cowherder and religious writer who, in 1649, entered a trance and had a vision telling him that the earth should be made a common treasury of livelihood to whole mankind, without respect of persons. They declared that, "We have chosen the Lord God Almighty to be our king and protector," thus denying all earthly authorities. They wanted to abolish private property, as well as buying and selling. Winstanley wanted to put these ideas into practice. In his home at St. George's Hill, he and his followers began to dig and work the common land, inviting anyone to join them and share freely in the fruits of their labor. Similar communities were established in different regions across England. Even though Winstanley himself was a Christian, and the diggers pulled heavily from the Bible and Anabaptist ideas, there might have been atheist stirrings among them. The same day that the diggers appeared in St. George, 6 soldiers broke into the local church, announcing to the priest and congregation that Sabbath, tithes, ministers, magistrates, and the Bible were all abolished. Their connection to Winstanley and the diggers is uncertain. Reactions from ordinary people were mixed. The diggers were strongly opposed in Walton-on-Thames and had to move to Cobham, where they were received at least somewhat more positively. Cromwell and the government were not bothered by them. General Fairfax regarded Winstanley as a pleasant person, even though he refused to lift his hat for the general. The biggest opposition came from the local landholders, who organized raids, economic boycotts, and legal action. By 1650, the diggers had been dispersed, even though radicalism continued to flourish in St. George, already having a history of it. The diggers had always been a small movement. We have only the names of 73 of them, and it is unknown if any of them or their ideas spread to the New World and the maritime or pirate community. But it must be noted that the digger movement was but one expression of communist ideas that had been floating around for several years. The Levelers were violently crushed in 1649, and some of their desperate, hardcore survivors began hoping for a miracle, for God himself to intervene, level society, and finally make it equal. They swiftly developed into a strange movement, derisively called the Ranters, an older term that had previously encompassed various philosophies interpreted as nonsensical ranting. Their central doctrine was that God existed in everything, in angels as much as in an ivy leaf, the material and immaterial, men and beasts. This idea was nothing new, as it had been brewing during the Middle Ages and might be traced back to the early ideas of Gnosticism. The issue with such a belief was that it gave rise to a wide spectrum of contradictory ideas, ranging from the Bible being purely allegory to a complete rejection of it. Some ranters believed they could be inspired by the Bible, while others critiqued its many contradictions, calling it a piece of witchcraft, mere romance, and only invented to keep people in Egyptian slavery. What is so interesting about the Ranters is that they wholeheartedly embrace these contradictions and the reconciliation of opposites, just how God was both Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. One ranter, a shoemaker, referred to Satan as the backside of God, emphasizing him as an opposite to God, but also a part of him. It's also kind of funny, which was quite typical of the Ranters. They often used comedy and tended to be quite crude. Ranters didn't necessarily have positive views of Satan, but they usually viewed him as either a creation of God, as not existing, or something which, like God, existed in everything and everyone. Hell and heaven became states of mind. Heaven when you laugh and enjoy the company of friends. Hell when you endure pain, suffering, and loneliness. We are reminded of the neo-Gnostic ideas found in Marlowe's Mephistopheles and Milton's Satan. The rejection of orthodoxy was naturally followed by a rejection of the clergy. Ranters believed that common men held as much divinity as Christ, and if every man could be his own preacher and prophet, there was no need for an organized church. This idea went hand in hand with the critique of authority and the upper classes. The gentry were condemned for keeping their fellow creatures in bondage and embodying the worst of qualities. Private property was the root of violence, and ranters often embodied communist ideas. All men were equal, and they addressed each other as fellow creature. This made them very appealing to poor and regular people, and even some criminal elements, which was highly unusual for philosophies of the day. Indeed, ranters believed that humanity would come together as one brotherhood, embracing a sort of pacifism with the hope that God would bring forth the final leveling of all society. They themselves did not have anything like an organized church, or even a sect. Ranters organized in small groups, each adhering to the central beliefs, but with strong variations. Some were like tiny cults, with ranks and initiation rites. But most of them were just gatherings of around 10 people that met in someone's home. Their enemies, including other religious groups and even the government itself, accused the Ranters of excessively sinning. There are woodcuts of them inspecting each other's butts and dancing naked, descriptions of them fornicating in front of others, and one ranter allegedly said that he would go into the house of office, the bathroom, and make a god every morning by easing his body. The Ranters did have a very different view on sin. They rejected moral law and viewed sin as a product of imagination. So long as the act wasn't God, or nakedly produced by God, it was as holy as God, wrote a prominent ranter named Clavecin. Since God is man and man God, and since God is good, all that we do is done by him, and therefore, good. During their meetings they would smoke tobacco, eat and drink, tell stories, dance and play music. Many of their meals were organized as parodies of the Christian sacraments. Swearing and blaspheming was common as well, and in accordance with hostile propaganda. they might have engaged in promiscuity and even polygamy. According to John Holland, enemy of the Ranters, they say that for one man to be tied to one woman, or one woman to be tied to one man, is a fruit of the curse, but they say we are freed from the curse. Therefore, it is our liberty to make use of whom we please. Another critic said how all the women in the world are but one man's wife in unity, and all the men in the world are but one woman's husband in unity, so that one man may lie with all the women in the world in unity, and one woman may lie with all the men in the world, for they are all her husband in unity. Since these accusations primarily came from the Ranters' enemies instead of themselves, it isn't certain how true they are, even if there was surely an element of truth to it. The leveling of society, worshipping by feasting, smoking, and being promiscuous does sound in line with the libertine lifestyle of pirates, aside from their tendency of appealing to the poor and criminal. The extremity of the Ranters made other movements distance themselves. The Anabaptists became some of their fiercest critics. At first, the Ranters were opposed in writing. Pamphlets and documents were written to ridicule and critique their outrageous beliefs, but they soon faced more heavy repression. The state came to regard them as heretical. Their books were burned, leaders imprisoned, meetings raided, and members flogged. By 1651, Ranterism had perished, at least on the surface. All of the radical groups of the 1640s and 50s were fluid and would often share ideas between them. The survivors would often be absorbed into other sects, the radical ideas censored and tamed. Ranter pacifism was absorbed into the Quaker movement, which lacked the Ranters' political radicalism. Quakers were common in the New World and would on occasion work with pirates, despite their pacifist and anti-slavery ideals. For those unaware, pirates were so active in the slave trade that they basically ran it at multiple points. Ranters themselves would reappear throughout the 17th and early 18th century, not least in the New World, showing up in New England in 1672 and in Barbados in 1660. It is not unimaginable that more of them existed behind closed doors, and their libertine ideals may have been appealing to more than a few pirates. In chapter 7 of the book of Daniel, the prophet Daniel receives visions of the world being overthrown and the Jewish people reclaiming their freedom from oppression. Jews and early Christians found strength in the imminent cataclysm, when their evil oppressors would finally be overthrown and usher them in a new paradise. When Christianity became established, these ideas became threatening to the social order, and Daniel's prophecies were interpreted as allegories of man transforming his soul. That was a bit too complicated for many a regular believer, and whenever Europe was thrown into disarray, moralists and common people would see it as evidence of imminent apocalypse. This gave rise to the idea of millenarianism, an apocalyptic event which would allow for the complete overhaul of existing society, often associated with the return of Christ and his establishment of the kingdom of heaven. Millenarians would sometimes take to violence. In Germany there was a large uprising in 1532, in England 1591. In the early 17th century, English religious thinkers began to develop millenary ideas into a proper ideology, known as Fifth Monarchism. In 1642, Henry Archer published a book in which he argued that there had been 4 monarchies: the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. Next would come a 5th monarchy, that of Christ. The Savior would visibly descend from heaven to establish the state, only to return and leave its government to the saints, until his 3rd and final coming after 1,000 years, heralding the day of judgment and destruction of all the wicked. Archer's primary concern was figuring out the exact date of the Savior's coming. He believed this to be when the 4th monarchy had finally expired, and so looked in the book of Daniel for possible evidence, finally settling on the year 1700. If you're thinking that Rome had expired way before then, Archer and the Fifth Monarchists saw the papacy as the continuation of the Roman monarchy. With the year of his coming determined, Archer and his fellows had to decide what to do in the meantime. Archer himself took a pacifist approach, saying that Christ's followers could not hasten the coming, and should instead wait patiently, ready themselves and eschew all evil. Others believed they could hasten the coming by direct involvement. When the King of England was toppled and the world turned upside down, they finally saw their opportunity. The Fifth Monarchists, the most radical of the millenarians, were great supporters of Cromwell, hailing him as the new Moses. This is when we get into pirates and their role in millenarianism. Cromwell was surrounded by a group of religious extremists, many of whom drifted towards millenarianism. He himself seems to have believed that England was the new Israel, destined to usher the world in the Second Coming. This positioned England directly against the Kingdom of Spain, the foremost Catholic power, representative of the papacy and of Rome, the Fourth Monarchy. The natural conclusion was that for the living Christ to come, Spain had to fall. Ironically, Spain had been one of the first foreign governments to recognize Cromwell's republic, and though the Lord Protector was initially flirting with the Spanish alliance, his army and merchant class were pressing him to make an incursion into the Caribbean, carve out a small colonial empire, and use it for smuggling and piracy. This ambition was hotly sponsored by millenarian thinkers, most important of whom was a colonial himself, New England clergyman John Cotton. Much like Archer before him, Cotton looked to biblical prophecies for evidence of the Second Coming. In Revelation 16:12, Cotton read how the sixth angel poured out of his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. The drying of the river heralded the final days, and Cotton claimed that to take from the Spaniards in America would be to dry up the Euphrates. Indeed, Spain's economy was entirely dependent on the extraction of American gold and silver. Their trade and domestic production was not up to snuff. If the cash flow could be stemmed, Spain would be strangled, the foremost Catholic power would collapse, Rome, the Fourth Monarchy, would fall. Christ is coming! Christ is coming! Inspired by these ideas, Cromwell launched the Western Design. After a string of disasters, the expedition finally captured Jamaica, turning it into a naval base for launching raids on Spanish property, just as Cromwell had predicted. What started out as naval officers bolstered by commissioned mercenaries soon snowballed into the rampant promotion of flat-out piracy, many of whom weren't even English captains. Jamaica became a horrible nest of pirates. It wasn't the only time that Puritans established piratical colonies. They did so in Santa Catalina, also called Providence, on Tortuga, called Association, and finally in the Bahamas, on the island of New Providence. You might know it as the Pirate Republic. It had its origins many decades before Blackbeard and Hornigold, and certainly had its roots in the anti-Spanish fanaticism of the Puritans. Spain and England signed a peace treaty in 1671, and though piracy did continue against the old enemy, it was slowly petering out. Old pirates began looking for new targets and new justifications for it. Around this time, New England was suffering significantly at the hands of the Barbary corsairs, their sailors kidnapped and enslaved by the North African states. They were vassals of the Ottoman Empire, widely regarded as a greater threat than even the Catholics, since the Ottoman Turks were Muslim. Meanwhile, New England smugglers and slave traders were venturing to Madagascar and the Indian Ocean, where they discovered unimaginable wealth possessed by the Mughal Empire, a Muslim dominion of the Indian subcontinent. From the pulpits of New England churches, fiery preachers raged about the horrors of Islam and the Turks, inspiring their warriors to go forth and wage holy crusade upon the true enemy. One of these preachers was Cotton Mather, grandson of the aforementioned John Cotton, and he had seemingly adopted his grandfather's millenarian rhetoric. In 1697, he and his congregation prayed for further mortifications upon the Turkish Empire, wherein we may see signs of the kingdom of God approaching. What if Islam was the fourth monarchy? Could the collapse of this dominion be the evidence of Armageddon and the coming of Christ? The fires stoked by Mather and his fellow preachers had a great effect on the public. When England went to war with France, New England sailors took up commissions, but sailed instead to the Indian Ocean, where they attacked Muslim shipping, not the French. Calling themselves the Red Sea Men, they primarily went after pilgrim ships bound for Mecca on Hajj. They committed horrible atrocities, such as torture, the destruction of mosques, and mass rape against a people they regarded as religious enemies, and seemingly in the name of millenarian ideas. Christ was coming at the end of a musket. Finding traces of leveler, digger, and ranter ideas among pirates is difficult. We know that many Buccaneers had been part of the New Model Army, known for its political participation and radicalism. That piracy tended towards crude democracy and egalitarianism that might have been appealing to radicals, and that they tended towards the religious extremism, magical beliefs, and libertine lifestyle that was reminiscent of these radical groups. None of these ideologies were as directly involved in the history of piracy as millenarianism, even if all of the millenarian thinkers weren't Fifth Monarchists per se. The Fifth Monarchy men eventually got in trouble with Cromwell over policy decisions, leading to their repression. They had lost much of their power by 1659, and the year after, the monarchy was restored. Many of their leaders were tried and executed for their role in the revolution, but as we previously saw, their ideas continued in England and the other colonies. Through the mouths of New England preachers, the smuggler captain on Jamaica, and the actions of pirates in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean. If there are any divergent political convictions, especially espoused by pirates, it would be Monmouthism and Jacobitism. These movements were deviant but not especially radical, and will therefore not receive a lengthy description here, though Jacobitism will receive its own future episode owing to its outspoken prominence among pirates. In short, these two movements supported alternate claimants to the throne of England. They did not seek to overthrow the societal order, simply the current ruler. These two movements are interesting to compare, because they were in many ways in opposition, and both are rooted in the same conflict. Charles II, son of Charles I, who was decapitated by Oliver Cromwell, spent much of his exile in the Catholic courts of Spain and France. He would later marry a Portuguese woman and was naturally accused of Catholic sympathies. When Charlie finally kicked the bucket in 1685, he was succeeded by his brother, James, a public Catholic. This provoked an anti-Catholic uprising, led by a pretender to the throne named James Scott, bastard son of Charlie and titled the Duke of Monmouth. Charlie had no legitimate children, but he had a lot of bastards. But yeah, the uprising was therefore called the Monmouth Rebellion, and was swiftly defeated in the Battle of Sedgemoor. Many of the prisoners were deported as indentured servants to the West Indian colonies, destined for borderline slave labor. Rebels are difficult to control, and the Monmouthites would cause significant trouble. In 1685, some of them escaped and allied with the Jamaican Maroons, escaped African slaves. There is a well-documented instance of a Monmouthite becoming a pirate, because he wrote and published an account of his adventures. It would form the basis of the Sabatini novel Captain Blood, which has been highly influential in pirate pop culture. The name of the pirate was Henry Pittman. He was a surgeon that tended both to rebels and royalists after the Battle of Sedgemoor, and became one of the many victims condemned in a series of mass trials called the Bloody Assizes. He was sentenced to 10 years of servitude on Barbados, where he and a party of fellow rebels managed to escape in a leaky boat, making it to a small island where Pittman was eventually rescued and inducted into a Buccaneer crew. He continued his misadventures in the Caribbean, before finally returning to England in 1688. The Monmouthite rebels were universally pardoned with the Glorious Revolution, when Parliament decided to oust James for his Catholicism, naming William of Orange, the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, the new King of England. A great many people were angered by this. Some were Catholics or had Catholic sympathies, some believed in religious tolerance, and others simply liked the Stuart dynasty, or believed that only God could decide who should be king, not earthly laws or parliament. They became the Jacobites. Though there were conspiracies and risings targeting William and his government, many were somewhat appeased by the fact that the throne of England was technically held by William's wife, Mary, who was a Stuart. They were further appeased in 1702 when James's daughter, Anne, became the new queen. She was also a great sponsor of privateering, since England was fighting a lengthy war against France and Spain. However, when she died in 1714, the same year that the war ended, the throne was rightfully meant to pass to her half-brother, James, also a Catholic. However, Parliament had instituted a law saying that only Protestants could become heads of state, meaning that the new legal heir was the Elector of Hanover, a German state. What? You see, he was the great-grandson of James I, King of England of the early 17th century. The controversial succession gave rise to a new wave of Jacobitism. There was a failed uprising in 1715, which Jamaica planned to partake in through its Jacobite governor, Archibald Hamilton. He had assembled a fleet of privateers, using them to pirate from the Spanish in preparation for the Jacobite rebellion. With the conspiracy discovered and Hamilton deposed, the privateers were declared pirates. They escaped to New Providence, kicking off the final stage of the Golden Age of piracy. Too many of these late pirates were outspoken Jacobites, naming their ships in honor of the Pretender or openly toasting his name. However, this will have to be further discussed in a separate episode. If you enjoy long-form pirate content and want to learn more about the Buccaneers, I'd recommend checking out this deep dive into them. Otherwise, don't forget to support Golden Gunpowder by liking, sharing, and hyping the video. And if you have the available funds, the best support comes from monetary donations via channel membership and Patreon. Members also get early, ad-free access to all of my content. Enjoy!